Month. Now, for those who don't know, the idea for Black History Month was invented or came up with by an African-American scholar called Carter G. Woodson. He wrote a book called The Miseducation of the Negro, which looked at the way in which African-Americans had to be functionally miseducated for transatlantic slavery and then the subsequent Jim Crow apartheid to function in America. But I would take what Woodson was saying, although I agree with him one step further, and I would say that for racism to function in human society, full stop, everyone has to be functionally miseducated about the human story. And no part of the human story, in my view, has been more distorted than the history of the African continent and then its descendants. So I'm going to try and share tens of thousands of years of history with you very quickly, some of the snapshots of what we should be teaching, because if we're not careful, what happens is Black History Month comes around and we do exactly what it was not supposed to be intended to do. We subtly reinforce the idea, which was argued by serious historians at one point, that Africa has no history, by teaching transatlantic slavery and Martin Luther King. And with the greatest of respect to Dr. King, brave and courageous as he was, I'm fairly sure if he was alive today, he would go spare at the idea that he was the sum total of Black people's contribution to the human story. So it's important that we look at what we should be teaching during this month to correct some of these misconceptions, because people cannot be blamed for their ignorance if they are genuinely ignorant. People can be blamed if they've had a different set of information and still choose to remain ignorant. So can I go on to the first slide, please? This is where I've chosen to start the story. We could have started the story, anthropologists are still telling us, that the oldest human remains ever found are in Africa, that we are all common ancestors of the Ethiopian Australopithecus called Lucy or Dinquinesh. But I've chosen to start the story here. For those who don't know, the Sahara was not always a desert. So it expands and contracts, in my basic geological understanding. As the rains migrated south, the Sahara expanded. When those tropical rains migrate back north, the Sahara contracts. Over thousands of years, this process goes. So across the Sahara, all across North Africa, we find some of the oldest cave art in human history. Pictures like this, all across North Africa. Next slide, please. We also find many, many examples of this. This is an astronomical observatory. In this case, arguably the oldest astronomical observatory in the history of humanity. Scholars believe somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 BC. So possibly as old as 11,000 years ago, two American physicists called Thomas Brophy and Robert Bouval wrote a fantastic book called Black Genesis, looking at the relationship between this astronomical observatory and the evolution of the ancient Egyptian religion and subsequent civilization. Next slide, please. Which brings us on to the first point of contention in ancient African history. Can you see here, for anyone who didn't see this film, and I didn't see this film, I'm not in the habit of watching propaganda, that Hollywood is trying to convince us that in ancient Northeast Africa, Anglo-Saxons were the ruling elite. People that look like Christian Bale. Now, for anyone who saw the film, which I didn't, but people told me, in this film, all the slaves and the servants were black. Now, for anyone who understands the way film and TV works, that doesn't happen by accident. There's a thing called a casting agent, and the casting agent decides who's going to get what roles. So some casting agent said, the ruling elite in ancient Egypt are all going to be white, and the slaves and the servants are all going to be black. We're going to project apartheid South Africa back 5,000 years into North African history. How accurate is this picture of ancient Egypt? Let's see. Next slide, please. Follow a little more. National Geographic Channel. This image here of King Tut. I don't know why we need a scientific reconstruction of King Tut. We have copious amounts of carvings and paintings of King Tut from his actual life, but apparently this is a French reconstruction based on his skull. This is apparently what King Tut looked like. We're going to see how inaccurate that is in a minute. On the other cover, this was an article that came out a couple of years ago called Black Pharaohs, Conquerors of Ancient Egypt. And essentially what the article said, which is a revised new propagandistic position in relation to ancient East Africa, aka ancient Egypt, that black pharaohs came into ancient Egypt right at the end of the civilization in the 25th dynasty, and they conquered Egypt, and because of racism, no one's ever told their story till now. But guess what? We're here to tell you that in the 25th dynasty, 3,000 years after the founding of ancient Egypt, black people finally got involved in the game. And the only people that believe different are crazy Afrocentric black people trying to make themselves feel better. This is almost exactly what the article says, even though I'm, of course, being sarcastic. Let's again see how accurate that is. Next slide, please. Now, this is the British reconstruction of Tutankhamun, based on the same skull. Can you see that if the French and the British were both using scientific techniques, how come the British scientists came up with this, and the French ones came up with one that looks French? Next slide, please. But again, there's no need. This is Tutankhamun in his own life. We've got to make up our mind. Was he jet black or was he red? Now, if you know much about ancient Egyptian art, or even ancient Nubian art, you will know that red was a symbolic color. I don't know what it meant, and we don't know what it meant, but all throughout ancient Northeast African history, even among the Igbos in Nigeria, you find in their art, men painted red, women painted yellow. I've seen this in Nubian temples. No one's arguing that that meant the Nubians were red. Of course, there are Africans, like Somalians and Eritreans, that have a dark red complexion. They're just as African as anyone from Nigeria. But Tutankhamun clearly couldn't have been both red and black. So we need to figure out which one he was. Next slide, please. Now, no one disputes these invasions, okay? When we talk about who the ancient Egyptians were, there's consensus that Egypt has been invaded over half a dozen times. I haven't even included in this list the Ottoman invasion, I haven't included the French or the British invasion, that all came after this. But the Arab invasion in the 7th century of the Common Era, then the Vandals, which is where the word vandalism came from, because they was a bit mad, to use the technical term. That came in the 5th century. They are German people. Then the whole of North Africa, not just Egypt, was a Roman province. Before that, Greek, before that, Persian in 525 BC. At the most conservative estimate, ancient Egyptian history, pharaonic kingship, begins in 3100 BC. Nonetheless, if we go with the most conservative estimate, can we see that the Persians still got to Egypt 2,500 years after the founding of ancient Egyptian kingship? So who was living in Northeast Africa prior to all of these invasions from people that are not from Africa? Well, let's see. The ancient Greeks saw the ancient Egyptians for themselves. They were in Egypt during the Persian invasion, and of course, then when they ruled Egypt for a little while. Let's see what some of them had to say. Next slide, please. Theodorus of Sicily. General Histories, Book 3, 30 BC. Now the Ethiopians, for those who don't know, Ethiopian literally means of the burnt face. It wasn't an insulting term, it was a generic term for black person, yeah? Back in the day, and it referred to generally all of Africa, and even the Greeks used it to refer to parts of India. If you go to India today, in southern India, you'll find people, some people, as black as any people in Africa. So it shouldn't surprise you if that term was used, but it was a generic term meaning black. Now the Ethiopians, as historians relate, were the first of all men. The proofs of this statement, they say, are manifest. They also say the Egyptians are colonists sent out by the Ethiopians. Now can you see, we're told modern science discovered that Africans were the first people on the planet. But here is an ancient Greek historian saying that Africans were already saying we were the first people on the planet in 30 BC. Herodotus, the father of history, there can be no doubt but that the Colchians are an Egyptian race. Before I heard any mention of the fact from others, I had remarked it myself. My own conjectures were founded on the fact that they are black-skinned and have woolly hair, afro. Yeah? The Colchians, by the way, are a group of people in southern Russia at the time. A whole host of other Greek scholars, including Aristotle, and there's loads more I could have put, seemed very unconfused about the ancient Egyptians' ethnicity. We can't have it both ways. Even the ancient Greeks were one of the most intelligent, civilized people ever, or they were so stupid they couldn't recognize the colors of people they saw for their own eyes. But we can't have it both ways, you see? Next slide. Now, here are some Egyptologists. It's important for us to understand the way early Egyptology evolved. When the French came to Egypt and colonized Egypt, it was in the height of transatlantic slavery, late 1700s, Napoleonic expedition to Egypt. The Sphinx, the pyramids, all of these things are newly rediscovered. And immediately the French are like, uh-oh, we've got a bit of a problem here, because we have an economy based on the pseudoscientific idea of racism, based on the idea that some races, namely the white race, an invention, is superior to other races, particularly the black. And the discovery of an ancient African civilization, thousands of years before there was anything of comparable stature in France or England, not an insult, just a fact of history, created some problems. Now, some scholars immediately reacted to this by saying, okay, well, clearly racism's nonsense. Hooray, we can do away with such a stupid idea. Of course, foreign policy realized this wasn't terribly convenient if your economy depends on racialized slavery. So even though some honest scholars came out and told the truth, many scholars went against this, and you're going to see how ridiculous some of the explanations got. So C.F. Vonley, a man who wrote a fantastic book called The Ruins of Empires, had the following to say. He made many other comments, direct comments about the ethnicity of the ancient Egyptians. This is one particular comment, one of my favorite. He said, "There are a people now forgotten, discovered, while others were yet barbarians, the elements of the arts and sciences, a race of men," now, of course, like most sexist men, he used men, but he meant all humans, because we just normalize that kind of language, men to represent all of humanity, now rejected from society for their sable skin and frizzled hair, founded on the study of the laws of nature, those civil and religious systems which still govern the universe. Champollion, not the main Champollion, but the brother of Francois Champollion, had the following to say. I'm not going to read it all, but if you look closely, he says that Volney's basically chatting rubbish. There's no way the ancient Egyptians could have been black. But let's get to the end, and this is how funny it is. Listen to this part. Volney invokes that of Herodotus, who recalls that the Colchians had black skin and woolly hair. Yet these two physical qualities, black skin and afro hair, do not suffice to characterize the Negro race, and Volney's conclusion as to the Negro origin of the Egyptians is evidently forced and inadmissible. Now, he didn't offer any evidence. All he said was having black skin and woolly hair doesn't make you black. And if we go back into the racial science of the day, you will understand that it was actually argued by otherwise intelligent people that there were two races of black people. There were Negroes and there were Hamites. Hamites were any Africans that didn't look absolutely stereotypically what we think of West African people to supposedly look like. Anyone that has a slightly thin nose or any kind of straight hair or any features randomly that we decide was a Hamite. And Hamites were responsible for all of the civilization in Africa, and they descended from Europeans. Negroes, on the other hand, they were the real black people. And even when we find evidence of Negroes, we'll just say they were Hamites, as you have here. This is how silly and how ridiculous ideas, pseudo-scientific ideas like race make otherwise intelligent people behave. Next slide, please. Again, two early Egyptologists saying very much the same thing. Egyptian civilization is not Asiatic, but African in origin, of Negro origin. However paradoxical this may seem, we are not accustomed, in fact, to endow the black or related races with too much intelligence. So Professor Abiy Amelou straight away hit on what the issue was. Francois Champollion, the founding father of Egyptology, the man who decoded the Rosetta Stone, what did he have to say? Because apparently, according to National Geographic, the only people that think the ancient Egyptians were black were crazy Afrocentric black people. But let's see. The Egyptians belonged to a race quite similar to the Kenuas, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, or Barbarous, present inhabitants of Nubia, Sudan. In the present Copts of Egypt, we do not find any of the characteristic features of the ancient Egyptian population. The Copts are the result of crossbreeding. Seems normal when a country gets invaded, there's interbreeding. The people that live in America today are not representative of the ancient indigenous Americans for the most part. Even though those people still live there, the average citizen of New York does not look like the average American 500 years ago. With all the nations that successively dominated Egypt, i.e. the Greeks and Romans, it is wrong to seek in them the principal features of the old race. And I could go on ad infinitum of Egyptologist after Egyptologist who, even if they felt compelled to racially abuse the ancient Egyptians, which many of them did, some of the art historians talk about how can you ever say their carvings are nice when they're so obviously Negro. Many of them, scores of them are like, well, obviously they were black. That's why they were uncivilized. So Egyptologists were presented with this real problem. Either ancient Egypt was civilized and European or uncivilized and African. And very few of them acknowledged that it was both highly civilized, highly technically advanced, and also African, but a few of them did. Next slide, please. This is the first pharaoh of ancient Egypt. The man who united the two lands. He came from what we call Upper Egypt. Now, to understand Upper Egypt is Lower Egypt to us. Upper Egypt is the portion of Egypt closest to Sudan, not closest to the Mediterranean. And the early kings of Egypt came from this region of Egypt. This is Narmer Menes carrying that stereotypical Negro face that we were told in old pseudoscience made a person inherently inferior. Next slide, please. 2,000 years later, in the tomb of Ramesses II, is this. This is reproduced by two European Egyptologists whose names are at the bottom. And this is what we call today the portrait of the races. This is how the ancient Egyptians in 1200 BC, so 2,000 years later than the founding of their kingdom, saw the different groups of the world, according to the hieroglyphics. Figure A is the ancient Egyptians as they saw themselves. Can you see? It goes right along with what the early Egyptologists thought. It goes right along with what the ancient Greeks thought. No one needs to be confused about what they look like. And in fact, it looks a lot like the picture of Tutankhamun we just saw. So that's how they saw themselves. They didn't seem to be particularly confused about their ethnicity. Figure B is Indo-European people. Figure C is other blacks of Africa, presumably the Nubians, who were the main people that the ancient Egyptians had as rivals. I don't want to give you the impression that there was this magical time in black African history where all black people just got along and bogled and sang Kumbaya together. That isn't how things go in real history, right? Because what some pseudo-Egyptologists have tried to do is said, but the Egyptians fought the Nubians, so they couldn't have been black. Okay. So what, all black people have just always got along then, apparently. Okay. Figure D is Semitic people, people in the Middle East. Now, can you see that the only difference between figure A and figure C is one of swagger? Figure A has 3 stripes, and figure C has 2. Other than that, they're exactly the same. Next slide, please. Now, what you'll notice a lot with ancient Egyptian carvings, and I don't believe it's quite ever got to the bottom of who was behind this all, but we have to understand this in context. The Sphinx has no nose on it, and the Sphinx has a very stereotypical Negro face. We have to understand the level of hatred that was being dealt with when early Egyptology evolved, and we start seeing all these granite statues that are otherwise perfect. Now, granite is a very tough substance, but their noses are just missing, and no one wants to explain why the noses went missing. But viewed in the context of the time and the offense that the idea that Negroes could have created such a magnificent ancient civilization would have caused, it seems fairly clear where some of this malicious behavior could have easily come from. Next slide, please. We just see loads of ancient Egyptian statues, they just ran into the wall and their nose just came off. Next slide, please. Can you see a lot of my Rasta brethren think that Rastas invented dreadlocks? Here is a gentleman clearly with dreadlocks, a few thousand years before the Common Era. Next slide, please. More noses missing. Next slide, please. More noses missing. Next slide. Thankfully, not all of the noses are missing. These are some heads from Tanite. Can you see? More dreadlocks. These are not the ones that often get displayed in museums. Often what's displayed in museums can be the most, or what is perceived to be the most European-looking ancient Egyptian carving. So you'll see Nefertiti everywhere. But we know Nefertiti's dad wasn't African. It's not surprising that Nefertiti was light-skinned and she looked a certain way. If you don't know that history, someone's going to say to you, this is Nefertiti. She's representative of what all the ancient Egyptians look like. Can you see how you'd be confused? Next slide, please. And of course, let me be clear, that's not me saying the ancient Egyptian population was in no way mixed. That would also be ridiculous. Ancient Egypt was a mega civilization. Like any civilization, it would have attracted immigration, it attracted invasions several times in its history. I'm not saying every single ancient Egyptian had totally jet black skin, because there's no way for me to know that. What I'm saying is, they definitely didn't look like Christian Bale. This is the Pharaoh Doza. Next slide, please. This is the Pharaoh Khufu. This is the gentleman for whom the Great Pyramid was commissioned. Again, just look at his face for yourself. Make your own decision on what you think he's likely to have looked like based on the evidence of people that carved him in his own time. Next slide, please. And the issue here is really the human story. In the Enlightenment, the idea that Europe had basically been responsible for everything positive in the entire human story, as ridiculous as that may seem to us now living in the 21st century, with the return of Chinese power, with the Indian mission to Mars, with all of these things that are going on, and it's clear how much the world is changing before us. It should be fairly obvious to anyone with half a brain that no one group of humans is responsible for everything wonderful that's ever happened, or all of scientific progress, or all philosophy. But 100 years ago, 150 years ago, that was considered a hard scientific idea, considered so normal that very few people even questioned that. And those European scholars which did question it, I could name some of them, probably no one in this room's heard of them. Have you ever heard of a man called Gerald Massey? He spent 36 years of his life writing a companion to Darwin's theory of evolution, working class white Englishman who taught himself to read, brilliant scholar, spent 36 years of his life writing a companion that tried to prove that not only humanity evolved out of Africa physically, but also culturally, spiritually, philosophically. He literally wrote 6 volumes. I have them on my shelves like that. Even though he was an Englishman, the only people today that read or publish his books are crazy Afrocentric black people. So it's very funny. I'm going to continue with that. So the human story is not the monopoly of one particular group of people. And even though the ancient Greeks, this has been one of the controversial areas, a scholar called Martin Bernal from Cambridge wrote a book called Black Athena in the 80s, which received a lot of attention, a lot of criticism, a furor around the book, partly because he was a Cambridge-educated scholar, partly because of who his family were. His granddad was an Egyptologist. But nonetheless, some people might feel that he overstated the case of Egypt's influence on Greece, but the Greeks themselves said, yeah, some of us went to study in Egypt, no big deal, as you can see here. And thus, Egypt was the cradle of the mathematical arts. Can you see, coming from Aristotle, that's a big compliment. There's another quote from Aristotle, I'll paraphrase, but he's basically insulting the ancient Egyptian priests because they wouldn't give him all of their secrets. He's acknowledging they had knowledge they would not share with him. And he insults them for it, not something we look at today. They had a value for pi of 3.16, which with no calculators, thousands of years ago is pretty impressive. I must point out that value is on a papyrus reed that we know is a child's school textbook. So we don't know whether or not they got a more accurate figure for pi, but we know that a high school student could work out pi to 2/100ths of a decimal place. The so-called Pythagorean theorem, 365-day calendar based on astronomical observation. They also had another calendar which took account of the leap year, but it didn't do it in the way we do it. It basically let the leap year run alongside. They understood that the year was 365 and a quarter days long, and they just let the quarter days add up until it came back round. I think it's 1460 years till it would come back round and the years would link up again, and they had a big festival. They understood the concept of the month and the zodiac based on groupings of stars. They pioneered heliocentric theory and the concept of the atom. Not according to Akala, but according to Isaac Newton. So if you've got beef, take up the beef with Isaac Newton. They knew of the planets Mercury, Venus, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter, calculated and predicted lunar eclipses, medical specialization. Back then, including, if you put into your internet search, a word called pesheshet, which is spelt exactly as it sounds, you will see that there was a government position called the Chief of Female Physicians. One of the fascinating things about ancient Egypt was the role women played in the society. I'm not going to come here and pretend to you that it was a feminist paradise, but what we do know is there were 5 female pharaohs. Women could inherit and bequeath property, and of course, we had female physicians. Medical specialization, shipbuilding and expeditions, copious amounts of literature in poetry and prose has survived. There is 3 great volumes of ancient Egyptian literature published by a scholar called Mary Lichtenheim. I suggest you look them up, in addition to the coffin texts and the pyramid texts and others. Next slide, please. This is Imhotep. Has anyone seen the film The Mummy Returns? Can you see that this real Imhotep doesn't look much like the Imhotep in The Mummy Returns? And he is quite arguably the first polymath, the first multi-genius recorded in human history. The same 2 American physicists I mentioned earlier, Thomas Bouval and Robert Brophy, or Robert Bouval and Thomas Brophy. I always get their names confused. They wrote a book on Imhotep's work. But he designed the oldest pyramids still standing in Egypt, the oldest medical books in human history. He wrote, of course, someone may have wrote medical books before him, but the oldest surviving we have. So we could properly call him the father of medicine. We currently call Hippocrates the father of medicine, but Hippocrates was born 2,000 years later.